Welcome to the Democracies College podcast series. This podcast focuses on educational equity, justice, and excellence for all students in P20 educational pathways. This podcast is a product of the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, or OCCRL, at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Learn more about OCCRL at occrl.illinois.edu. In this episode, Angel Luis Velez, a research assistant at OCCRL, talks with Dr. Michelle Espiño, an associate professor of higher education at the University of Maryland College Park, on understanding community contexts and institutional responses associated with educational achievement and outcomes along the academic life course of racial and ethnic minorities.
Dr. Espiño Lira joined the Maryland faculty in 2012 as assistant professor in the Student Affairs concentration at University of Maryland College Park. Dr. Espiño Lira's contributions to the field of student affairs, administration, and higher education focus on understanding how institutional cultures, policies, and practices, as well as community contexts, affect and inform educational achievement, outcomes, and experiences along the P20 pipeline for racial and ethnic minorities, particularly for Latinas and Latinos. Dr. Espiño Lira draws upon cultural assets, traditions, and personal elements of resiliency at the individual, familial, community, and institutional levels to illustrate mechanisms within the educational system that can lead to success. Dr. Espiño, how are you today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much for inviting me to the podcast.
I want to get to it real quickly. Looking at your research expertise, I can see that you place central attention to issues of equity in higher education, using cultural assets and traditions, especially critical race theory, Chicana feminism theory, and even using community cultural wealth by Darayoso. What were the factors or experiences that led you to your current research interest? And why is this research significant to higher education access and equity?
One of the most important aspects of conducting any research is knowing whether it resonates within you. It's something that I often talk to my doctoral students about this. Can you wake up in the middle of the night and be willing to work on the project? And so for me, it's a question that I don't think I've ever been able to fully answer. And it's, how did I, as a first-generation college student, manage to go through these different educational systems and now find a really strong career in being a faculty member? This was not something that I knew anyone who was a professor. I saw them on TV maybe, and television shows, but it wasn't something that we had access to at all. And yet that seemed to be the path that I took. And I think part of that is not just thinking about it from the individual level, but really thinking about how systems are put in place from a very early age to siphon people into different tracks. And we know this with academic tracking as an example of the ways in which children are tracked into vocational track or academic track. And so I happened to be tracked throughout my childhood through academic tracking and honors classes and advanced placement and those kinds of courses that allowed me to enter into a college curriculum, even in high school, and then advance into college. But that happened for me and not members of my own family. And it wasn't because we had different values or that we were taught differently. I mean, we had the same family structure. And so it's a question I don't think I'll ever be able to fully address. And so that's the quest that I have, is this one question about how did this happen for me and not for others. And I don't really think it was just about me as an individual, but how I fit into this greater cog, right? I'm a cog within this greater machine that weeds students out. And that particularly happens at the community college level. And we know that occurs when they're trying to think about affordability. And when you get that sticker shock, from the onset, you think, well, I can't really go to a four-year university, so I'll try my hand at community college. But we know that there are community college students who actually end up spending more than if they had gone straight through to a four-year college. That often happens. So there's a disconnect between trying to have, an understanding of how to work that system in terms of financial aid and access and opportunity. We also know that there aren't transfer articulation agreements across all institution types, and so we have community college students who are taking credits that will never transfer, and they lose time and they lose money when they try to transfer. And the whole notion that there are different even tracks within community colleges, that some are, their intent is to be in college so that they can transfer to a 4-year, and then there are some who are there to receive specific certification and training. And so a community college is having to do multiple kinds of services and fulfilling the needs of multiple types of student populations in ways that our 4-year institutions really don't have to think a lot about and don't really see themselves in relationship often with community colleges.
Why equity is important in your research?
I think it's important in my research because it's important for our students. I mean, we have changing and everybody talks about these changing and shifting demographics, but the reality is that our students in K-12 education are changing. They're a different face, but they also have different lived experience. And so why are we not trying to figure out better ways to educate our children? So I think, how do we create practices that not only help to sustain children in K-12 education, but help them to aspire to college if that's the avenue that they wish to take, and then help them to stay there and persevere, and then aspire to other opportunities, whether that's graduate school or professional school, being entrepreneurs or giving back. There's different ways in which to contribute to our society. And so I think we aren't creating systems that are in place to support those students to be able to see what's possible. Right now we're only dictating that for certain communities, there's only certain avenues that you can take.
Thank you for that insightful answer. I started at a community college myself, and I was tracked also to do more of a vocational, more of a certificate. Right. And it wasn't until my brother actually transferred to a 4-year institution that I actually thought that I could actually make it to the 4-year and really graduate. So I agree with you that we need better, systems in place, especially articulation agreements.
Absolutely, and I will say also, as an undergraduate, I went to a Hispanic serving institution and had no idea that I was in an HSI. Although we were probably 60% Latino on that campus, I didn't understand that there was a difference between the experiences that I had in undergrad and being at a PWI. And it wasn't until I went to graduate school that I realized that most of the people were not going to look like me. I had no idea that was going to happen. It was quite a culture shock when I went to a predominantly white institution.
Thank you. You talk a lot about stories to tell the experiences of Latino students, administrators, faculty in the educational pipeline, and how those are rooted in kind of inequity and historical factors. Can you talk a little bit about your research in that area?
Well, one of the things that I think is very important is that we understand where we came from. I mean, that's something that was always taught with for me, is that you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been, and to acknowledge that there are people who have paved the way for us. And so that's one of the things I try to do when I think about the work, is to look back at how particularly like Mexican American children have been treated in educational systems, and inevitably how that's playing out even in today's society, the view of who our communities are and how we can contribute. And so I think that really dictates for me, the kind of work that I'm trying to do is to develop these counter narratives. But not just counter narratives so that I resist these narratives about our communities, these myths and stereotypes, but it's also about empowering our community to believe that it is possible, that there are new pathways that we can blaze for the future generations that will be important. And so I think that that's an important aspect that we have to be always conscious about, is how laws and policies, they can be changed, and there's more that we have to do, and it happens at the grassroots level, but then it also happens at university leadership levels. And so I think that that's something that we're going to have to continue to critique for ourselves.
Thank you. What role can community colleges and HSIs play in the advancement of Latinas and Latinos in higher education? And I ask you this because we know that Latinos, for the most part, begin at community college, right? What can those institutions do to support Latinas like yourself and to really continue advancing in the education pipeline and to improve those rates that you talked about earlier about the graduation at the doctoral level, which is way less than 1%, right?
Right, yes. Well, I think, it isn't just the community college's responsibility. I mean, they're doing a lot. And as I said, as I mentioned, they're having to manage multiple populations at the same time. And so I think one of the things that we have to do is figure out what's the universities, especially in terms of developing those town-gown relationships, that includes community colleges. And so what are we doing to ensure that there are pipelines in place? And so some of that has to do with financial literacy, helping students to consider, what the costs are, and not just financial costs, but the costs of education in terms of, I think often what happens is with many students, and particularly low income and students of color, is this idea that, well, if I start working now, I'm making money now for my family. And right now is what's most pressing. I can't be thinking 5 years down the line that this is going to pay. But it does. And I think that the more that we spend trying to help students understand, like if you were to actually, earn that 4-year degree, that bachelor's degree, that this is how much more you can contribute. Even if right now in the short term, it seems like you really need to be giving back to your family. This is the challenge. But we also have to incorporate families into this. I mean, we think about community organizing from the parent-teacher experience in K through 12. Well, the same thing needs to be applied in college, and thinking of not just college students as individuals, but as people who are part of these larger, relationships and communities. And how do we incorporate them onto our college campuses? Where my institution is located, we're nestled right between a Latino immigrant community and a predominantly black county. And I will tell you that it's very possible that neither population has really ever visited our campus, even though we're right in the middle. And so these are the realities, is that, we have an obligation. And so what does it mean to be a land-grant university? With HSI specifically, I think what troubles me the most about HSIs, those emerging HSIs really see it as, I want to meet the 25% for whatever motivation that you have. And then, but that doesn't mean that you're Hispanic serving. You just happen to have, by no real intention of your own, there's no change to your mission statement, there's no change to your learning outcomes. There is no evidence to prove that you're making a specific difference for Latino communities. And when that's not happening, right, then this moniker, this designation, doesn't mean anything outside just a fancy stamp that we get to put on our university. We're still 75% non-Latino. And so, who are we really catering to by doing that? Whose interests are being met by getting that designation? And so I think we have to hold those institutions accountable as well, to say, if you're going to be designated in this way, it isn't just for federal funding, but for really transformation of your communities.
Today we have a very politicized environment nationwide. Many people are unsure about the future of public education from P to 20 and beyond. I would like to know your thoughts on the current national political climate.
Oh my goodness.
And its potential effects on educational policy and equity in higher education institutions.
Well, that's a really challenging question. And I think it's something that I think many faculty are going to have to really think about, is that our work isn't just being done for the sake of research anymore. That there really needs to be a balance between doing the work, but then using that work to inform policy. And I think that can happen at the local level within our institutions, but then also within the larger city or town, and then the county, and so on and so forth with the state policies. Because often what happens is that states are reacting to federal policy, but they're still implementing their own policies, regardless of what the federal, national discourse is occurring. And so states do have some power in deciding how they want to best support education, regardless of who's in the Department of Ed or what kinds of financing policies are being put in place. I think we have some real serious issues with financial aid, and I am very concerned about college debt and what we're doing to support students with college debt. But I also think, okay, what can I do? How can I translate my work? And I think as a qualitative researcher, the challenge is very great, because people will look at the stories and see them as just anecdotes. But I think there's a way to map these stories with data points as well. And so I think the community, the scholarly community, has to get together to figure out how do we do interdisciplinary kinds of work that will inevitably go into policy briefs, we can establish relationships with our Congress people. I mean, this is how we need to make these changes and to advocate and lobby. And I think that that's across the board. We're talking about scientists going on marches. We're talking about, women and communities of color, immigrant groups. I mean, so I think one of the things that we're challenged by is the narrative of being a country of immigrants. And I do think that we need to unpack that a little bit, because we're not all a country of immigrants. We are a country of colonization, we are a country of slavery, and of land acquisition. And so I think those are particular communities of color, underrepresented minorities, and minoritized communities that weren't immigrants and are far more subjective and subjugated to a lot of our policies and laws. And so I think that that's also what we have to consider as well. So I think, it's thinking about how do we support our brothers and sisters who are, our international faculty, our Muslim faculty, our students who are coming here for a good education, but then also what are we doing to help and support our domestic talent pool? What are we doing to educate our underrepresented minorities, students in this country too? So I think that there's different angles that we have to take. And so I think we have to piece apart what's going to be a priority for each of us. Where are we going to put our efforts and our fight and resistance?
You want to give us any pearls of wisdom? Any final thoughts that you have for us?
For in general about?
About equity and access.
I think in the end, our work, it has value if we're working together to advocate for our communities. And this notion of a lone scholar, or that I'm going to do my piece and and not share, and I mean this whole notion of competitiveness, I talked about this in my talk, this rugged individualism, competitiveness, not celebrating each other's successes. I think that is something that really hinders us from being able to really celebrate those small achievements along the way. I think that's and to sustain us. We have to find a way to sustain and motivate each other. And that's why Brother Sister Scholars are so important. That's why, finding your Latino Scholar Collective is an important part of this, is that, we have to stop just fighting for our own small piece, but figuring out how we can fight for a larger piece that we can share with others. And I think that starts in our, with our families all the way through to college and then into graduate school and beyond.
Thank you, Dr. Michelle Espiño Lira.
For more information about the academic life course of racial and ethnic minorities, we recommend that you visit Dr. Michelle Espiño's website at the University of Maryland for a list of selected publications. For more podcasts, links to today's recommended resources, or to share your comments and suggestions, visit occrl.illinois.edu/democracy or send them via Twitter at OCCRL. Tune in for our bonus episode this month, where Dr. Ebony Zamani Gallagher will talk to Dr. Lori Patton Davis, a professor of higher education at Indiana University and president-elect of the Association for the Study of Higher Education, about Black women's role in institutional transformation in higher education. Background music for this podcast is provided by DubLab. Thank you for listening and for your contribution to educational equity, justice, and excellence for all students.